Andy Burnham's arrival in number 10 has sparked an enormous amount of debate over the past few weeks. Much of that conversation has understandably focused on politics, but this morning, I think we'd like to take a slightly different and more broad approach. We're interested in what this moment means for organisations represented in the room. We want to know, is power genuinely shifting away from Westminster? Will decisions affecting Britain's towns, cities and businesses increasingly be made outside of London? And what could that mean for investment, infrastructure, skills and growth? Many of you here this morning spend your working lives engaging with government, investing in places or helping organisations to navigate political and economic change. So throughout this discussion this morning, I'm going to keep bringing us back to those practical implications. Introducing our panel, first, I'm delighted, to be joined by three people who bring very different perspectives, I think it's fair to say, to this conversation. First, Arooj Shah. So Arooj has twice served as leader of Oldham Council, and through that role sat on the Greater Manchester Combined Authority alongside Andy Burnham and other Greater Manchester leaders, including Bev Craig and Paul Dennett. She's now chair of Labour's National Constitutional Committee and is a close ally of our new Manchester Mayor, Bev Craig. So she brings both a Greater Manchester perspective and an understanding of the wider Labour movement. Next, Henri Murison, MBE. Henri is Chief Executive of the Northern Powerhouse Partnership, which brings together business and civic leaders to make the case for greater economic prosperity in the North. Its work focuses particularly on the things that will determine whether the North can fulfil its economic potential, including transport, skills, productivity and devolution. And I'm particularly happy to welcome someone from the other side of the Pennine today, because it's not just about the North West, is it, Henri? I make that point because I feel, and I've written quite a lot recently about the North becoming shorthand for Manchester, and as I think we all know in this room today, there's rather more to it than that. Henri wrote something recently that I thought really captured rather brilliantly how much this debate has changed. For years, devolution and the regional inequality agenda were the political equivalent of a cult indie band on BBC Six Music, passionately championed by a small group of enthusiasts, but rarely troubling the mainstream. And I think your conclusion, Henri, was that it has now achieved something approaching breakthrough success and wider popular appeal. So we'll test whether that's true this morning. And finally, Joshi Herrmann. Joshi, you might know, is the founder and editor of Mill Media. Its founding title was the Manchester Mill, which Joshi launched in 2020 because he wanted to see whether people would value and pay for local journalism if it was done differently. In Mill Media's own words, that meant journalism that was more in-depth, more nuanced and more enjoyable to read. 6 years later, Mill Media has grown well beyond Manchester, but the Mill remains deeply embedded in this city region. It's profiled, investigated, critiqued and championed what's been happening here, including Andy Burnham and his administration. And if I may say, it's hosting its inaugural business summit this autumn. And I'm sure some of the businesses in this room today might be interested in speaking to Joshi about that afterwards. I'm very excited to be part of that. If you turned on pretty much any current affairs programme covering Andy Burnham over the past couple of months, there's a high chance you will have seen Joshi, whether it's the BBC, Sky News, Times Radio, Politico, or even The Spectator. So I think it's fair to say you've had a busy few weeks. Thank you for being here. So let's get into it. Henri, I'd like to start with you, please, just as you've sipped your cup of tea. When Andy Burnham announced number 10 North, you described it as nothing short of a revolution, which is a big statement. Successive governments have promised to rebalance Britain and shift power away from Westminster. We've had Northern Powerhouse, we've had Levelling Up. We've already had government departments and civil servants moved outside of London. But this time, we're not just talking about an office. We've seen policy functions move north. We've seen the revival of the National Economic Council through number 10 North. So why is this different?
I think it's different because of the scale of change it represents and the level of ambition. And so I think the way I would describe number 10 North, I know lots of people were talking about it over coffee before we started, is that it's a process, not really just an outcome, if that makes sense, which is that if you want to kind of rewire the British state, which is what Andy said down the road from here when he spoke at the People's History Museum, part of a long line of speeches given by politicians in the north of England in museums in Manchester. So there's a book to be written there for someone. You look at what he's trying to achieve, and it's fundamentally about saying that you're not going to rely on the same processes and structures in Whitehall to deliver that change are going to disrupt those, which means that when you then promise to do things like devolve significant tax powers to mayors, rather than that get stuck in 2 years worth of treacle, it will actually happen. And I think the change in institutional kind of constructs is not about creating a centre of power that sits in Manchester. It's about a mechanism for taking power out of Whitehall and then redistributing it. So it's not a hoarding decision, which is why all the kind of debates about why is it here and not somewhere else and all this stuff, I didn't really think was that important. It's a relatively small amount of people. And actually, if you look more generally at the numbers of civil servants who've moved out of Whitehall in the last few years already, including under the previous government, that's a much bigger change. But the issue has been that those people, particularly anyone who had any aspirations to move up the civil service, would have been spending a day or two, at least a week in London, having to trail up and down. So there's also an element to which that it also changes the way that kind of that wider process of getting more different thinking into the civil service is able to work. Because if I'm honest, the kind of ambition of the kind of relocations of civil servants that happened under the last government had not really been fulfilled, because you essentially still had the same people largely still in London with the same realm of experience making the same decisions. And I think that there's no model of devolution where central government doesn't need to be engaged and involved in it. So we're not going to turn into federal Germany overnight. So the UK central government is still going to have to play a big role in the success of places. And so a presumption of wanting to take a different approach and to disrupt the traditional way of doing things is pretty important if that's going to work. And so that's why I think it's so important. And I think that the kind of ephemera and whether the civil servants who've come up initially happen to live in London or not, all of that I think is pretty irrelevant. And I think it's largely a very well orchestrated attempt by a number of people who don't like this change to try and undermine Andy in this agenda. And I think we should largely see through that for what it is, because fundamentally it is a significant change in how Britain works. And I'd much rather one or two civil servants got trained from London every week, rather than hundreds and hundreds of them, as does happen every week, have to trail down to London, having gone to the trouble of building the nice offices and given them lots of training and experience. We then tell them that if they want to influence policy, they still have to go on a train to London to see a minister or see another senior official. And I think that just isn't the way it should work. So I think that amongst all the ephemera and all the kind of the noise, I think there is some significant substance. And I think the cabinet statement that came out just over a week and a half ago now is genuine evidence of the scale and ambition, and the institutional construct and the fact that you need a mechanism to achieve that is just a means to an end. What the cabinet statement outlined around the type of country you want to build and the where power and the ability to initiate economic change is going to sit is a fundamental change and does meet that test of kind of rewiring. It's a significantly different way of operating to what we've done in the past.
And it sounds there to me anyway that you are pretty convinced that it is more than symbolism. Well, what should businesses be watching for as evidence that that it is more than stated ambition and symbolism? Is there something that you think that businesses should be on the lookout for to see through that?
So I think the credible proof points all come from the autumn onwards. So you look at whether you have a significant change in the way that we distribute tax across the country and how tax is allocated. And I think the fiscal devolution changes are the most important of all the other changes, that there are other things I think that are worth focusing on as well. And if you get to a point where, as a private investor, you can work up into a combined authority, and has started to happen in Greater Manchester, the person sitting across the table from you, whether it be the mayor or one of their team, can commit to long-term streams of funding to underpin whether it be your private investment or whether it be you building for them a piece of privately funded public infrastructure, whatever it might be. And I'm not presuming, do you mean any one particular formulation, but whether you are someone who wants to bring private funding or finance into a city, or whether you have a private investment that is dependent on a publicly funded project to make it credible and make it happen. And there are a number of examples of that. If you look in Greater Manchester, there's Atom Valley and Northern Gateway, not far from where Arooj still is very much involved. Across the Pennines, you look at the kind of West Yorkshire mass transit system. Do you mean if you are a group of investors wanting to build houses and leisure around Leeds United's Ellen Road Stadium, you cannot do that unless someone builds a tram there, because it is not a credible thing to do if the transport is as it is today. So at the moment, you're sitting across from a mayor who has no ability to promise you anything, because all they are is essentially affording Vox to London to send the collective wishes of a place down to Westminster and to Whitehall in particular. And actually what we're now going to be saying is that over most of the decisions that matter to drive local growth, it will be the combined authority and other regional institutions. Do you mean various development bodies, your particular mayoral development corporations, whatever particular institutions are sort of covered by that auspice, that will have pretty much the final say about whether something happens or doesn't happen. And they will then be able to pay for whatever it is they promise you themselves, rather have to go and ask government for that money. And that is a completely different conversation. And it avoids a load of transactional costs, because at the moment, if you're a business wanting to do something in any of these places, you haven't got a single conversation. You can have a single vision with the local public sector, but you all then have to go and lobby central government ad infinitum to make stuff happen. Now, obviously, that might not be terrible for Grayling, for some of your competitors, but it's not the best use of your time or their time. It'd be much better if we could all spend our time attracting other private investors into our city regions, rather than getting what is often relatively modest amounts of public money to unlock that private investment. And the focus is then on how you can crowd in private capital and private projects, as has happened in Greater Manchester, right? Not just in the city centre, but in other examples across GM, where when you suddenly have more power and authority, rather than spending your time having to justify your own plans, you can actually do the much more important job, which is to make sure that those public interventions, those public assets are not stranded or isolated, but they leverage significant private funding and finance, which should be the test whether this works, because it's not just about government delivering growth for the country in every postcode. If you unpack that, what that is giving local leaders the opportunity to create the conditions for the private sector to create growth in every postcode. Because the public state, even if you make central government a bit smaller, regional government a little bit bigger, the public sector is not going to create that wealth and opportunity on its own. It's going to have to be the private sector that in the end creates the types of jobs we know we could create through kind of Andy's broader commitment to reindustrialisation, which I think is also very important. That is going to rely on the private sector to do that.
Well, on that point, we have many private sector representatives here today. Thank you, Henri. Arooj, coming to you on this one, from your experience in Oldham and across the GMCA, you've seen both the opportunities, for businesses created by devolution, but also perhaps some of the inequalities that remain within a successful city region. If we are starting to see a structural shift in power, what should that mean in practice for northern businesses? What opportunity do you see?
Well, I think it's a fantastic opportunity. And I think the other thing about number 10 North is, like, aside from people being or thinking it's symbolic, which I think it is, I think for me, it's the cultural mind shift that he's trying to sort of like, the message that he's trying to send, because that's what he ultimately wants. And I think when we've watched Andy operate across the combined authority, he's some of his own frustrations, some of our frustrations as leaders. One of the things was that we know that you can't make real economic growth in a place. You can't deliver change in a place unless you are collaborating with people. And I think the opportunity for business is great. I think what number 10 North is going to do is do something really different, which is absolutely say that you have access to people on your doorstep to make things happen. And the success of the combined authority and everything that we've been able to achieve that has driven the economy here in Greater Manchester is our collaboration, whether it's with the private sector, whether it's the public sector. Bringing all those people together is what delivers real economic change, and actually not having to fit into this like national program and, actually having the ability to like align policy to local demand and need has been what's been different in the combined authority. And I think that is going to be at a larger scale now, and it's going to be a huge opportunity for businesses, because the one thing that I know that Andy does is really listens to people, and he has the ability to really bring people behind his vision, and that is because he delivers in a way that I don't see many other politicians deliver, and he keeps he meets people where they are, and I think this is going to be a huge opportunity for businesses, and one that I think we should all be really looking forward to, actually.
Do you think that being physically closer to government actually makes it easier for businesses to be heard?
I
I think
think
you alluded to that a little bit just now.
Yeah, and I think picking up on Henry's points, which I agreed with everything you said, actually, it's really important. I think, when I think about the Good Growth Fund and, how that operated in Greater Manchester, I remember a very awkward meeting in Stockport, actually, where, officers were trying to sort of like relay what they thought that meant. And actually people, leaders in Oldham, Bury and Tameside were like, if that's going to work and it has to work for every part of Greater Manchester, it means we have to do something differently. And Andy immediately listened to that and was flexible. And flexibility isn't a weakness, it's a strength when you know it's going to deliver. And what we'd asked for is like the same sort of levers to deliver and drive economic growth, but to pay back longer, because that's what places like Oldham, Bury and Tameside need. And I think that is going to be huge, because he gets that. He understood that's what was needed. And he also understood that actually politicians were really obsessed with political boundaries, because that's we're quite territorial, but actually the people that we represent cross them all the time, whether it's to socialize, whether it's to, for job opportunities, whatever that may be. And actually for all parts of the country to do well and to get good growth in every single postcode, that's what it means. You need symbolic change, but we need decisions being made closer to where people are and the communities that they're going to affect.
And finally, on this topic, what do you think it would be helpful for businesses outside Manchester city centre to see or to receive that they aren't currently getting?
I would possibly say, well, actually, I think that tends to, I don't think that's the issue. I think it's the flexibility in the approach. And I think the collaboration is going to be huge between businesses. And I think with Andy and with everything that we know, with what he's done, what he's achieved and what he stands for, I think collaboration is what he's saying is a given and not a catchphrase. And I think that it's no matter where you are, it's just how you access those powers to make changing the places that you represent.
Thank you. We've talked there quite a lot about Greater Manchester, but of course, Greater Manchester isn't the North, and the North isn't one homogenous place. So let's tackle a question that perhaps sits underneath a lot of this. And Joshi, I'd like to come to you on this one. You spent 6 years watching Greater Manchester and Andy Burnham very closely. We hear the term Manchesterism used increasingly often, but I'm not entirely sure everybody means the same thing when they use it. So what is Manchesterism? Is it a genuine economic and governing model? Is it a style of leadership, or is it a convenient label? What do you think?
So thanks so much for having me here. I think that there is a thing that you could define as Manchesterism, isn't there? And I think we can probably all, from living in the city and being in the city, we can all sort of articulate what that would be. And it would be kind of what makes Manchester stand out versus competitor cities. A greater political stability, a greater sense of sort of pragmatism, throwing away some of the sacred cows of sort of like Labour politics and being willing to work with Tory governments, coalition governments, Labour governments in the same way, putting your interests ahead of your sort of ideas and ideology, right? So Manchester was willing to do things that Liverpool and Leeds weren't willing to do at certain times. When other places were extremely set on building social housing, Sir Richard Lees and Sir Howard Bernstein were saying, actually, people are really asking us for social housing. We've already got loads of social housing in our city. We're going to go and get hundreds of millions of pounds of investment from the UAE to build private rented housing. People on the left tend not to be incredibly comfortable with financializing assets, right? It's particularly like the basics of life, as Andy Burnham talks about now. But housing is the most basic asset, isn't it? And we've financialized the hell out of it in Manchester. I mean, most of the blocks are owned by, pension funds, et cetera, in Bavaria and Canada. So doing loads of things that would drive economic growth, but that don't sit easily with one particular political sort of idea. I think that kind of hard, pragmatic, we want growth at all costs Manchesterism is a coherent set of ideas. And my question about Andy Burnham is, how much does he really believe in that stuff? Because if you look at the last 2 years of Andy Burnham, the most of what he's said, particularly in interviews to sort of the New Statesman, et cetera, is a much more left-wing vision, isn't it? It's about taking public control of key industries, bringing down the cost of living by making sure that, you know, key assets are not financialized, etc. Now, that's not at all what's happened in Manchester. It may be what he wants to do with the country, or it may not be what he wants to do with the country. It may be what he wanted to say for 2 years when he thought he was going to be running in a leadership contest against Wes Streeting, which didn't eventually transpire. Now he's in government. There's a third version of Burnham, I think, emerging, which is a sort of like cost of living Burnham, right? It's just like, we're going to do tiny incremental things that will save you 20 quid a week to make your life easier, which that's a perfectly legitimate form of politics. I think it fits with Burnham as a politician quite well because he's an instinctive guy. He sees little opportunities. Can we make it easier to help you cancel your subscriptions? Yeah, let's do that. Can we take £5 off your energy bill? We'll do that. That's, I think, probably the most authentic Burnham that there is. I remember he used to go on the BBC Radio Manchester show, and people would sort of mention things to him on the phone in, and then the next week he'd be talking about them in press conferences, and then they'd turn into policy. That's much more Burnham, I think. He's not a man, I think, of big sort of political ideas. So to come back to the sort of Manchesterism point, that's why it's been such a muddle for people to work out what Manchesterism means, because you've got this guy who comes from the city that has a particular way of doing things. But in the past 2 years, he started to say a bunch of things I've never really heard him talk about before, like the fact that he hates neoliberalism. That was never really mentioned before, but now it's apparently a big part of his sort of political mindset. And now in office, we've got a different version of him. And therefore, you know, you can't call Manchesterism the other stuff. You can't go around and say Manchesterism is taking control of housing or building social housing, because that's not what we've done. Very, very little social housing has been built. The vast majority of housing has been private, rented, highly financialized, owned by overseas investors. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I think many of the people in the room would think that was good for economic growth, but it certainly wasn't the thing that he was talking about during the Makerfield by-election. So that's where the muddle is. I think if we're defining Manchesterism around the sort of should we call it Bernsteinism? I think Bernsteinism is easier to define than Burnhamism, put it that way. So there are different visions of how to do things going on here.
So many isms flying around at the moment, aren't there? I was actually going to ask, do you think that Burnhamism is Manchesterism, or is there an evolution? You know, is there a coherent philosophy that's being carried through, or are we still, as you talked about, you know, on Newsnight recently, can those 2 or even 3 versions of Burnham comfortably coexist, or are we moving into a new phase?
I don't know, because Henri talks about like how really what economic growth is going to be about in the north is facilitating private investment, right? So we just need to make sure that the proper infrastructure goes in, proper schemes go in, so that private companies can make the investments they need to make. Sure, but they're not going to do that if you think they're about to nationalize their business, right? They're not going to do that, because who would invest in that way? If during his time as mayor, Andy Burnham had said, I might be nationalising all the housing in Manchester, then the people in the UAE wouldn't have invested hundreds of millions of pounds, or the Bavarian pension fund, or the Canadian, whatever. So, you know, I don't think there is a Burnhamism. I wrote a big piece for the Mill saying I've been looking, you know, stop looking for Burnhamism. I've been looking for it for 6 years and it doesn't exist, because I don't think he is a politician who has a coherent set of political ideas. He's not like an Ed Miliband, right, or Margaret Thatcher, or even a Tony Blair. I mean, if you think about those kind of prime ministers, or even say David Cameron and George Osborne, they all had like an idea that they were going to implement in government. Like Thatcher was going to like tame the unions and essentially privatize industry and, you know, unleash the spirit animals of industry or whatever. And Tony Blair was going to modernize and invest in public services to prepare Britain for the 21st century. And Cameron and Osborne fundamentally every day talked about cutting the deficit, didn't they? We're borrowing too much, we need to cut the deficit. I hope that Andy Burnham's governing idea, the big one, is about devolution, and that he is going to devolve loads of power, because I think we need to do that. But my concern is that that's one of like 20 things he wants to do, and that's like in month 1. And we've already seen that. And I think it's really difficult in the British state, where getting things done is incredibly difficult. I think it's very difficult to do 20 things at the same time. I think you've kind of got to pick one big priority and push that through. And I'm so far unconvinced that there's that level of focus on one thing. I mean, you know, first speech on the steps of Downing Street, I'm going to end rough sleeping across the country. Where's that come from? You know, you weren't able to end rough sleeping in one city, despite investing tens of millions of pounds of taxpayers' money. Is that going to happen across the country? Possibly. But then that would be a big priority that you really need to push through. I don't think you can do a million things in our system. We don't have an incredibly efficient state. So yeah, I'd be skeptical that there is a coherent Burnhamism, but there is a Manchesterism, and I think if we stuck to that, that would be a coherent governing philosophy, and it clearly works in this city.
It's really interesting. And on the point of devolution, I was quite interested in something that I think you commented on recently, Henry, which is, if metro mayors are increasingly the routes through which devolution happens, and the central government devolves power, what happens to places that don't have one? I'd be quite interested in the panel's view.
So they end up with what the state would have otherwise done. So, and I think the point is that if you look at, for example, skills policy, today's the day that we celebrate the results of all those people who've been studying for vocational qualifications and A-levels, they will get what the state thinks that they should have in their place. Does that make sense? Which is essentially the same as in every other place. And I'm a bit resistant to the whole kind of Cornwall kind of what about us thing, because actually the first place that had any sort of devolution deal, if you're a real nerd for this stuff, was Cornwall. They were the first place they got a form of devolution. It wasn't mayoral devolution, but they did have a devolution deal with the Cameron and Osborne government. So I think this will take different forms in different places, but actually Arooj and my good friend and long-standing collaborator, Jim Herrmann, had already set us on the route to universal strategic authorities without much fanfare or excitement 2 years ago, because nothing under the previous government came with fanfare or excitement. So it wasn't a reflection on Jim. But it was the right policy. So we are busy creating mayors all over the place. And in the north of England, this is a bit of a moot point, right? Because we're basically now in a row with the Reform leader of Lancashire about whether he's prepared to accept another person who has some power in Lancashire. But it's like whether or not the Reform one doesn't seem to really bother him. He just doesn't like the idea of someone else being around. But like once that gets resolved, this will be universal in this part of the country. And I always use the example when I'm not in the north talking to places like Southampton, who with their neighbours have now got a deal in Hampshire coming along sooner rather than later, where they were really keen to get into this kind of fast lane long before it became the default policy. So the point is, anywhere that wants growth wanted this ages ago, regardless of it being a universal requirement. So actually the idea we're going to have to force this down the throats of every place in the country is not really true. And my favourite example in the north is like York and North Yorkshire, where I happen to grow up. And like, this is like proper rural. Like North Yorkshire is like the biggest like local authority by area in the country, I think still. And like they have an elected mayor. Do you mean? And they quite like their mayor. Do you mean it works really well? It doesn't work the same way as here. He has different priorities and he works on different issues. But the fundamental model of giving somebody some power to improve a place and the ability to unlock some of the barriers to growth, it works in like pretty York and rural North Yorkshire, just like it works in the north of this conurbation. Does that make sense? Like, and you couldn't think of two places more different in terms of demographics and the economic realities. So I'm more positive about the fact that we should do this. It was always this wasn't a kind of big federal model. This was an economic policy with big governance and democratic implications. Others, IPPR North and others, made the argument you should do it the other way around. And I think that's a fair argument, but that wasn't one that George Osborne was particularly keen to listen to. So this has been done incrementally because that's what was doable at the time. But it was still pretty unpopular in the Conservative Party, giving what were perceived to be sort of Labour areas all this power and money. I mean, it wasn't easy for George Osborne to get that through the Conservative Party. And you look at the history of devolution, if it wasn't for various members of the cabinet, we'd have had devolution in many parts of the south of England sooner, but self-interest and sort of not wanting local government reorganisation, basically, in rural shires is mostly what delayed it. But you talk to Lord Heseltine, and go back to the Radcliffe Maud reforms, people have been trying to reform local government in this country for decades, right? So it's not like we didn't need to do that anyway. So I think there's a kind of an obvious point of, we probably needed to get rid of two-tier local government anyway. If you're doing that, then you can do this really easily. So it actually shouldn't be that hard. And I think that actually in those places that don't really want growth, in parts of the south that are kind of essentially areas that don't really want growth, we have to sort of ask, maybe they don't need devolution. Because the point of this is, if you're not interested in the economic levers to improve productivity in your place, maybe you should just let central government run it. Does that make sense? No, I don't think that's the right answer. But if there are places that really can't be bothered to try and deal with the problems in their places, or those problems just don't feel big enough or significant enough to be bothered about, then maybe they don't need these things. But I mean, there isn't a single part of the north of England that hasn't been wanting devolution. Businesses in Preston, businesses across Lancashire ring me up all the time to complain about the fact that they haven't got the tools they need. An area that had the most EU funding per head of almost anywhere in the country now has no money to support growth because it doesn't have a mechanism to get that money out of government. That's not good for Lancashire, right? So the overwhelming majority of businesses and often wider civic stakeholders all see that this is a good idea. The issue is just getting local politicians sometimes to agree the detail. Not everyone's quite as practical and thoughtful as the leaders in GM were all those years ago when they did their deal with government. But the basis of that deal, as it's evolved, is actually a pretty robust model that does largely work with slight modifications and tweaks pretty much everywhere.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time. I've got a slightly unscheduled question to finish us off with, but we'll do one more before we get to that point. And returning to Greater Manchester, Arooj, you, as I said in your introduction, have been a close ally of Bev Craig through her election for the mayoralty. What should we expect Bev to do differently from Andy, if anything?
I don't think she has to necessarily do anything different. I think, I think she has the advantage that Greater Manchester has probably the most developed combined authority in the country. And I think with proposals such as number 10 North and fiscal devolution, that's going to make that role even more important. But I think the one thing that makes Greater Manchester work, and I think what Bev should continue to do in that spirit, is Greater Manchester wasn't effective and the devolution agenda wasn't effective here because of just a strong mayor. It was effective because there was collaboration with the 10 local leaders in the boroughs, with businesses, with universities, with the public sector. And that collaboration is what made it really successful. So I think she should continue working in that collaboration and in that partnership. And I think that is the key to success. And I think, picking up on what Henri said earlier and the point about the Greater Manchester mayor role, and I think the importance and the success of that is it's really important to have a strong mayor, but that alone doesn't make things happy. Collaboration across the sector does. And I think for me, I think the one thing that Bev needs to continue to do to make the success in Greater Manchester is to make sure that actually having a strong mayor is important, but also strong local leaders too, and to amplify strong local, amplifying the success of that is to make sure that you don't replace the ability and the strength of local leaders. You just further just amplify it by, concentrating on what we can do together is going to be successful. I just don't think it's a case of something Bev needs to do or needs to do differently. I think we have to really understand that actually collaboration is what has made Greater Manchester and the combined authority successful.
Thank you. And Joshi, I know you held hustings, didn't you, for the mayoralty? It probably seems like an age ago now. What were your impressions of Bev and her campaign?
It was a very dramatic evening, actually.
It was.
The Reform candidate walked out after turning up. Yeah, we had a great hustings. I think I don't know what Bev Craig will do differently, but I'm sort of cautiously optimistic about the type of person she seems to be. I'm sure you've all met her in different settings. I met her a couple of times for interviews. I think she's a real details person. I think she really understands local government and the mechanics of it. And her whole background is being a councillor, senior councillor, council leader. And that's a very different background than Andy Burnham brought, obviously, because he'd been a cabinet minister. And I think that the next phase of Greater Manchester will be a phase in which there's more money, there's more powers, and there's more complexity. There are more, they're going to have a single funding pot, basically. So instead of previously, you get 20 million for this from the government, 200 million for this, and they're just strings attached pots. Now there's a single funding pot, so you can actually make trade-offs. You can say, we're going to spend more on this and less on this, which I think requires a different type of mayor than we've had. I actually don't think it matters if she's as publicly charismatic as Andy Burnham is. She probably isn't really, but I don't need her to be really good at TikTok or whatever. I just want someone who really understands the machinery of a much more complex situation than we had 8 years. I mean, there were very, very few powers, hard powers, when Andy Burnham took over. There will soon be particularly with Andy Burnham in number 10, plenty. If Henry's right about the tax, the sweeping fiscal devolution that we're about to get, then there'll be incredible power in the hands of the mayors, much more similar to a US mayor or a German mayor or whatever, maybe not quite that level, but I think someone like Bev Craig is kind of what you want. I mean, I don't say that in a party political way, because we don't party politically advocate for anyone, but just having met her, I just think like maybe that's the kind of expert administration that we're going to need in this period, rather than the going on Sky News and making a noise about the city, etc. And also, I suppose with Andy Burnham as Prime Minister, you're already getting that kind of national promotion. And maybe what we need locally is a kind of a really good administrator of the city region. So that would be my like very first impression. I may totally change my mind after a few months and totally withdraw that. But that's sort of how I feel after meeting her a few times.
Right. We're almost out of time, so I'm just going to finish with a quick question, which one or all three of you are very welcome to come back with your thoughts on. We've talked about number 10 North, and we've talked about devolution, business, Manchesterism, Burnhamism. What's the one thing that no one's talking about? Have we missed anything?
I think that probably there is a bit of a missing link, which is that you are going to need private money as well as more public money. So you look at the debate in the last few weeks, we talked a lot about, can you get a bit more money out of the spending rules? I used to work for Lord Jim O'Neill. I don't disagree with that. That's a good idea if you can, within the existing fiscal rules, give more money to the public financial institutions, more money to the various funds that are looking to invest, particularly alongside mayors. I think that's a really positive thing. But you are going to need private finance and private funding as well. And I think there are a number of us talking about that, but the government hasn't yet articulated that agenda. And I think it does come back to the point Joshi was making about the academics that you spoke to the Productivity Institute down the road would make the difference between the Manchester model and Manchesterism, which is the Manchester model view of the world is very much in that space. Like, you're going to have to do that. Now, Andy's a very good communicator, so perhaps that isn't the stuff you lead off with, right? I don't think the fact that it's not been top of the billing means it's not going to be on the agenda. But at some point around the budget, you're going to have to get more honest about where is the limit of what all this public money can do. Because even if you have a bit more public money, there are still limits. And particularly things like what Andy was talking about during the by-election around a link, for example, from Manchester and the north more widely to Birmingham, there is no public money for that. So if you are going to do that, you're going to have a conversation. The same way that in order to pay for Piccadilly Station, we had to have a conversation about fiscal devolution. Sometimes the big project or the big thing forces a wider discussion because because that's the case study example. And I think we'll get to that point, but we haven't yet got that.
Maybe a self-serving point. I think the aspect of this whole devolution thing that doesn't get enough coverage is the local scrutiny point and like the journalism point. So we're giving lots more powers to regions that used to have these big newspapers, like the Manchester Evening News had like 200 journalists, and the Liverpool Echo had 200 journalists, and they were like deeply scrutinizing the local area. You had like 3 different people writing just about politics, just in Manchester, right? And now we're moving powers to these regions where those newspapers have dramatically declined in staffing, okay? And so you have very few people actually covering local politics. Obviously, our company, Mill Media, we have small teams of people in Leeds, Manchester, Birmingham, Glasgow, etc. So I think we're doing a good job of scrutiny, but we are very small teams, and we are outnumbered just by the number of people who work in the press office at like one local authority in each city, right? So there'll be probably 150 people who work just in the press offices of the Greater Manchester press office and all the combined councils. So that we are way outgunned by the number of people who just work like promoting those councils, let alone the police, the local businesses, etc. So my concern would be that you devolve loads of powers to places where there's very little scrutiny, and then money gets wasted, unofficial advisors get appointed who turn out to be not the best appointments, etc., etc. So I think that's a concern, and I think the media part of it needs to be thought about by consumers as much as anything. People need to pay for local news so that we can redress that balance, I suppose.
From my perspective, I would say probably prevention. I think we spend a lot of time, whether it's housing, whether it's community safety, whether it's, social care, employment, whatever it is. I think we spend so much time responding to crises rather than thinking about how to prevent them. So I think prevention needs to be really high on the agenda as well.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. We've covered a lot this morning. What feels clear to me, at least, is that Number 10 North has created, if nothing else, an opportunity. The question now is, I suppose, whether it leads to real changes in where decisions are made, how quickly things get done, and whether places across the North and beyond are heard. Arooj, Henri, Joshi, thank you very much for being with us this morning and sharing your thoughts. Thank you, everyone, for listening to the podcast. And thank you to guests in the room for joining us today.